And here we go. Hi, gang. Monday. What's today's date? Monday, May 19th, the day after the Florida Panthers secured their Atlantic Division. I don't even know what it's called anymore. Their Eastern Division second round playoff series
Yeah.
with a 6-1 victory against the Toronto Maple Leafs to advance to the Eastern Conference Final for the
On to the AFC Championship, as we would say with the Dolphins if they reach this point.
if they ever got to this point. Yeah, and I'm trying to draw a parallel here, and there's actually a little bit of a parallel, and we've discussed this before. And for those who don't want to hear about hockey, it's hockey as it relates to the Dolphins in a bigger picture, and we'll explain. Um, the Panthers made a drastic philosophical change the year after they finished with the most points in the regular season, but then lost in the second round of the playoffs against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Got swept, if memory serves. They hired a new head coach in Paul Maurice, got the prototypical playoff player in a trade with the Calgary Flames. Thank you, Calgary Flames, for Matthew Tkachuk. And since then, they've been to the Stanley Cup final, won the Stanley Cup, and now they're in the Eastern Conference final. Contrast that to the Toronto Maple Leafs, who now have lost 7 consecutive game sevens, who have 4 very high-end, high-skilled players who, again, are not built for the playoffs. And this relates to the Dolphins. And the Maple Leafs also gave a lot of money to some of those big stars. Tell me that doesn't look like the Dolphins in a certain way, where they got to 11-4 in 2023. Could be looked at as they're on the verge. It could happen at any year. They rewarded everybody. Major step back in 2024. And now, as we'll discuss a little bit later, what's it look like for 2025? Floor is yours, Dave Hyde.
It's funny. I was talking to a Toronto writer during this series, and I said, "Man, you guys ripped the Maple Leafs like we ripped the Dolphins." So I mean, there's a lot of parallels there. They haven't won since 1967. The Dolphins, of course, haven't won at all since '73, et cetera, et cetera. But to draw on it's interesting. I spent so much time around the Dolphins in my year, and then I dropped in on the Panthers here and there, and then certainly in the spring the past few years because of what they've done, and it's just fascinating to see. And I'm not just keeping this on the Dolphins, but any great team. It's fascinating how they're run and who's running them, and it starts with one guy coming through the door for the Panthers. It was Bill Zito, their general manager, made the trade for Tkachuk, decided they weren't good enough, got Paul Maurice. Paul Maurice's system built for the playoffs, in turn gave confidence. You talk to Sergei Bobrovsky, all of a sudden he could believe that, okay, I believe in this defense in front of me, as opposed to, they were trying to score 10 goals a game and everything, and he was left out on that. So all of a sudden, the parts came in place. And to compare this to the Dolphins, Mike McDaniel tried to give the team to the players last year. I mean, he gave it to them.
Yeah.
Tua in the offseason said, this is Mike's team, it's our team. The difference here is, I mean, this is Maurice talks about, I don't need to say anything behind the bench. The best thing in the off days is the players talking to each other. The difference is these players with the Panthers have earned that distinction of being their team.
Mm-hmm.
They've shown through results, through how they work, year after year. Now we're in year 3, year 4, really, of playoffs, some playoff success, great playoff success for 3 straight years. But yeah, every team wants to be player driven, but it has to be an earned thing. You just can't say, here, any player, here, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Ramsey, you guys be captains. I mean, it's really interesting to see. Right now the Panthers, for 25 years, the Panthers were as bad an organization as there was in sports. Zito came through the door, everything started to change, and now they're as good a franchise as there is in sports right now.
Yeah, it's also fair to mention that the Panthers have had some good fortune along with the skill of Bill Zito to identify players who could thrive with the Panthers, because he pilfered the Buffalo Sabres for Sam Reinhart, who, mind you, was like Reinhart was the second overall pick in the 2014 draft. And then also and I don't want to spend too much time on hockey because this is a Dolphins podcast. But again, trying to correlate to the Dolphins here. For Brandon Montour as well, and in the Calgary Flames, of course, for Matthew Tkachuk, as well as Sam Bennett, who was the fourth overall pick, or Bennett was second and Reinhart was fourth, something like that.
Bennett was fourth.
Okay, so he was able to identify guys who could thrive, and the Dolphins, again, they went for big trades, not for what sort of distressed assets would be the term, which was Reinhart maybe a little bit in Buffalo because he wasn't living up to his billing, and he comes to Florida last year, scored 56 goals, and if you were surprised by that, it's not like that dude's not a player. I mean, anyway, I don't want to get caught up too much in that. A little bit of news for the Dolphins on this Monday comes from actually out of Jacksonville, where first-year head coach Liam Cohn told reporters after practice that his team would conduct joint practice with the Dolphins, and I used the weird conjugation there because I don't know if it's going to be a joint practice or joint practices. There are no details other than they'll be working with the Dolphins. Remember the rule, teams are allowed a maximum of 4 joint practices to spread out however they want. The Dolphins last year did 2 with Atlanta, 1 with Washington, 1 with Tampa Bay. Who knows if they're going to do, if it's 2 with Jacksonville and 2 with another of their preseason opponents this year, who are the Chicago Bears and the Detroit Lions in the first 2 weeks of the preseason, both games on the road. So we'll find out at some point how it's spread up. My guess is Mike McDaniel is going to use up all 4. For this Jacksonville specific, it's going to give us an opportunity to get eyeballs at practice on Travis Hunter, the second overall pick in the 2025 draft. And for me, I don't know about you, Dave, but when I go to training camp, I get a lot more and get a much better gauge for where the Dolphins are when they're practicing against another team as opposed to practicing among themselves.
Yeah, and I think part of that is every NFL team's trying to figure out how to do training camp anymore. Other than like the Chiefs go out, they're the last team now that goes out, has to a different site and practices hard for 5 or 6 days among themselves. And that's what Andy Reid does, and that team's won that way. But most of the teams are trying to figure out exactly what, and the Dolphins certainly are on the outer envelope of progressiveness in this regard of not practicing hard during training camp. So to your point, when another team comes in there, it does give a certain measure of, okay, what are we really seeing? Because any training camp after 10 practices of playing the same guys, you can say, well, it's good practice for the offense, but it wasn't a good practice for the defense, and
right,
vice versa. So, it really doesn't matter to the opponent, whether it's Jacksonville or Washington or whoever. It's just to get another side out there. But I'll be interested, like you said, get a look at Travis Hunter, get a look at the next chapter of the Jaguars, and see where they are.
Correct, with a new head coach, and the Dolphins are facing two new head coaches in the preseason, Liam Cohen and Ben Johnson of the Chicago Bears. No, because you mentioned when the Dolphins are practicing among themselves, it's like, wow, the offense really killed it today. Well, that means that your defense sucked. So it's really rare that it's going to be, you can have some practices where both sides have their moments, but generally speaking, you'll have one side that's looking good, one side that's not looking good. And it's also because you're confined to looking at one team, sometimes it's hard to get a gauge at that team where it might look a lot better than it actually is. And we've been guilty of that at times. Just conversely, there have been some times where we look at them like they look like crap. Well, they look like crap because the defense is going to be real good. That's maybe a few years back down the line. I remember, for example, last year, it didn't take a football savant to look at Jaden Daniels and go, oh, that dude's a real deal.
The other thing is interesting to see how teams work. Excuse me, sorry. I thought we were how teams work, how the other teams work too, compared to the Dolphins. Again, training camp's changing. It's not how it was even 10 years ago now, who's working hard. But you saw some of that, a culture of comfort, I called it, with the Dolphins last year. And it put up, warning lights to me when they're coming out there, their work pre-practice without helmets on, and you look across and there's Atlanta or the Redskins, Washington with in full gear, and Atlanta's running sprints after practice, and the Dolphins are just walking off the field after practice. I mean, it showed, yeah, it showed the contrast that a balance of, okay, we don't think the Dolphins are really working too hard, and now you look at the other side and they really aren't working too hard. Now, I do have to say, I'm not this. That's not a criticism to me of McDaniel, in that his teams have always started off fine, generally.
Absolutely.
So it isn't like I'm saying, oh, they don't work hard, they're not ready for the season. But it does make a measure of, if you believe, and I'm not sure where I stand on this, do teams get tougher? And a lot of old time coaches, you had to teach toughness in training camp. And to your point, we were talking about the Panthers, Paul Maurice, the coach, every camp, start a camp, 5 days are the hardest 5 days of practice the whole year. And he does that intentionally. So, I again, I'm fascinated by the way the Dolphins run this camp, and because they start off well, I can't really say it's the wrong way to do it, but it is a different way.
Yeah, and the issues they've had with injuries, and they've been probably on the higher end of the NFL ranks in terms of number of injuries and key injuries in the second half of the season the last couple of years. They're not at the top, and I know Dolphin fans want to believe that no team's gotten the kind of bad luck the Dolphins have had. Yeah, there have been some other teams that have been hit just as bad. The Dolphins absolutely have had their share of bad luck. And but is it really related to the fact they're not practicing hard enough in training camp? Is that why Jalen Phillips pops an Achilles on that crappy turf at MetLife Stadium in November 2023? Or Bradley Chubb takes a wrong step, tears an ACL at Baltimore that year? Or Austin Jackson winds up with some knee issues last year that put him on IR? I'm sorry, I don't necessarily want to believe that. Then why is it happening? I mean, who knows? Maybe it's bad karma, bad juju. Who knows? But I was going to go back to like some of these joint practices last year. Again, it was Washington, Atlanta, and Tampa Bay, which was good work, because Atlanta, I believe, was 8-9 in contention for the playoffs to the end. And then Tampa Bay won the NFC South, and Washington went all the way to the NFC Championship game. I remember in 2017, the Dolphins practiced with the Philadelphia Eagles in Philadelphia in the summer, and it's pretty evident at that time the way the Dolphins were getting manhandled in the trenches that either they were really, really, really bad, or Philly was really, really good. And it turns out Philly wound up winning the Super Bowl that year. So
The thing I remember about that is getting a call afterwards from someone who had been talking to Philadelphia people during the practice, and they said they're going to cancel the next day's practice. And it came out a little later that it was canceled because of a flu bug going through teams. And I was like, huh.
Yeah,
I said,
Dave, sorry, you're talking about a different year, though. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Because what they said was the Dolphins were hitting hard in practice, and it was a very physical Dolphin team. And Philadelphia did not want to go a second day for risk of injury. And so I thought that was interesting, what goes on sometimes in these practices.
That was the first year McDaniel was there, and then there was, I believe it was the last preseason game, and was it 2022 or 2023? I'm not sure. And then they played the preseason game, and the Eagles didn't use any of their guys. The Dolphins did.
22, yeah.
22, and they completely smoked them. And the preseason game was like 48-10 or something like that. No, I was talking about 2017. That joint practice was up in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And there was a drastic difference between the way those two teams looked. And it was like, again, and the Dolphins in 2017, that was a year Tannehill wound up the whole year on IR. Jay Cutler was the quarterback, and I think they were 7-9 maybe. and the Eagles wound up winning the Super Bowl with Nick Foles as their quarterback. So who knows how's that gonna play out now? As we stand here in the middle of May, what's your biggest reason for optimism for the Dolphins, and what's your biggest cause for concern?
Well, the biggest cause for concern is the secondary. I think that should be everybody's biggest cause for concern. Chris Greer said that they got a plan for the cornerback, so it's May. The plan doesn't have to be in place in May. I assume he has something, and it involves a post-June 1st trade of Jalen Ramsey would be part of that, I would assume. So, no impatience on my part right now because there's time for him to show this plan. But between the safeties that they got, which, you look at their portfolio, they haven't lasted full seasons, spot starting. And then you put that with the cornerbacks, where if Jalen Ramsey leaves, and certainly looks like he's leaving, you need two cornerbacks just to field a team, and we're not even talking number one cornerbacks. That's going to be difficult, I think, to find at this point. But so that's the concern of in a passing league, you don't have a secondary to stop the pass. In May. Now we'll see where they are in August and September. There's time. The biggest sense of optimism would be I think they've done a good job of changing the concepts on offense. By that I mean I can see elements of a inside and stronger running game than they had. I can see a third receiver, which would certainly help a lot of the concepts they want to do. A big receiver, a different type of a receiver. So, I think they've gone out and learned from obvious mistakes last year. And we get back to Chris Greer's playing at guards and the inside of the offense, and that didn't work out well. So that would be my sense of optimism. Now, my sense of reality is the offense is going to have to carry this team right now, the way it looks.
Yeah, and one intangible source of concern for me is I notice a pattern of the Dolphins always thinking that what they have is good enough because the players are going to evolve and progress and improve to a certain level that's required for the team to succeed. And again, it's mid-May. It's too early to suggest that this is what the roster is going to look like in training camp. But if you were to tell me right now, is it impossible the Dolphins have decided, we like what we have with our young cornerbacks, that's how we're going to roll? Would you dismiss that possibility? I wouldn't, because the Dolphins that's what they did on the offensive line last year. And no offense, but if I have to hear Chris Greer one more time say that, well, our offensive linemen work really hard. Okay.
Well, I would hope. I would hope they'd understand the difference between a guard impact on a game and cornerbacks impacts on games. So I mean, you can get by with serviceable guards. That's what they tried to do. It didn't work last year. You cannot get by with two serviceable cornerbacks. This league will eat you up. And you go down the roster and look at the quarterbacks, and they will be salivating if this is who the Dolphins are putting out there at cornerback.
Yeah, but I was talking more in terms of this overall idea of the Dolphins maybe thinking they can get more out of their players than actually is there. And I think that's what they did last year at guard. And this is what I hope does.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
My biggest reason for optimism is twofold. Is number one, Tua plays all 17 games in 2025 like he did in 2023. And more importantly, Tyreek is the Tyreek of 2023 again before he got hurt. And to me, with those two factors, plus the additions that they've made with Westbrook Akine, maybe one of the running backs, the young running back, emerges to help out Devon Achane, who I would like more in a, what's the word I'm looking for, in a jack of all trade role as opposed to a workhorse, which to me still not necessary. That's not his ideal role. I'm going to say that until I'm blue in the face. I think the possibilities are interesting for the offense. I think the defense is going to be a massive question mark no matter how we slice it, particularly once Jalen Ramsey is gone, which and I don't know how that can be salvaged. I was going to ask you this. Do you recall any instance where there was an impasse in the in the offseason like there is right now with the Dolphins and Jalen Ramsey where, things got salvaged, fences mended, and the player played for the team that year? I can't think of
Well,
one.
you have to go back. I mean, to a whole different era of the league and a different. I mean, for instance, Dan Marino sat out preseason, and there were headlines back and
Yeah,
forth for weeks of his contract. But that's over a contract, and
right.
he wasn't going to get traded. Even though there was a time he walked into the Dolphins office and said, "Would it be better for both of us if you traded me?" But that's a different era
Correct.
of the NFL, and nothing in this is like the Jimmy Butler situation with the Heat, really, in some regards, in that you have a guy who's on a big contract. The Dolphins gave a lot of money, who said, "Nah, I don't want to be here." Now Butler wanted more money. I don't think that's the case with Ramsey. I think he just said, "I don't see a winning program here, and I want to get out of here." I'm 31, and and this gets into we're talking team building and leadership and who the front office gives money to. I mean, you got to know in today's era who you're giving your money to, and not only giving money to, but then giving more money to. And their three highest paid players are Tua, Tyreek Hill, and Jalen Ramsey.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk of that's your foundation. That's that speaks to where we are right now.
Yeah, Jalen Ramsey's got to find his joy, right? Um, yeah, I don't know how that gets salvaged, and it's not going to help the product on the field if you wind up having to give him up for pennies on the dollar because of his contract, and you can't get
Right.
more. That does not make the Dolphins any better. Which is why any thought of this idea of the Dolphins trading Tyreek Hill as another addition by subtraction scenario also is not making the Dolphins any better. And um, I know your colleague at the South Florida Sun Sentinel, Chris Perkins, suggested that 2025 was a rebuilding year. Do the Dolphins really see it like that, though? I don't think they do.
I don't know where that's coming from. I'm looking at what they did now. What I think is they were more conservative and resetting the salary cap rather than just constantly throwing money out there. And so they were responsible. There's
Correct.
a difference between being responsible and rebuilding. And I look at what they did again. I thought they made some nice moves on offense. I see what they've done, and okay, I see possibilities there of what were liabilities last year. Now look, okay, you can we'll see, but you can see how what their plan is on offense.
Yep.
And the defense again, they got a little bigger with the draft and some of the moves they made, but the back end is a mess right now.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot of youth up front too, and which is again, ideally, all of those guys, Kenneth Grant pans out, Jordan Phillips pans out, but until they actually do it, we don't know. We just hope. And I don't know if you saw this, NFL.com, like one of their writers ranked the 8 division title winners from last year in terms of vulnerability as far as being able to repeat, and the team deemed the least vulnerable, shockingly enough, was the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah, and who do you have take who do you have could take them? It's not that. Look, Buffalo's very very good team, and you have Josh Allen. You're going to be that's your window. As long as he's there, their window's open to win. But it's sort of like the Tom Brady era. It was the Patriots and a bunch of teams who couldn't get out of their own way, and that's sort of where we are right now with the AFC East.
Yeah, and strictly from the Dolphins standpoint is they have so many question marks that would have to come up with positive answers to even make a run at the Bills. Would have to be like everybody panning on the secondary, the young defensive lineman balling out, Patrick Paul being proving the answer at left tackle, James Daniels holding up with his coming back from the Achilles, your two edge rushers, Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips being able to get back to their pre-injury form. That's an awful lot of ifs that need to become exclamation points for the Dolphins to be able to make a serious run at the Buffalo Bills. Of course, this is always with the caveat: Josh Allen gets injured and goes on IR. All bets are off. Am I
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I mean, Tom Brady missed 1 year. The Patriots won 11-5, and
That's a
the
good point.
Dolphins won the AFC East in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo goes way down if Josh Allen goes out, because you look at the rest of their roster and there's nothing really there that scares you. But to me, the interesting team in the AFC East, if you're going there, is New England. They made a ton of changes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, brought in Mike Vrabel, so they're going to be a tough team. And I'm curious to see where they go. What, can they take a big leap forward, or that's going to be the team really for me to watch and gauge what's going on, as far as where the Dolphins are in relation to everybody below Buffalo.
No, I agree. Final thing here. It's a scheduled question. I'm going to ask you two separate questions. Take either one or both, or punt on both if you want. It's your choice. Did anything jump out when you first saw the schedule? Would be one question. The other one is, do you like, not like, or don't care about the fact that they play the other three AFC teams within the first four games?
Yeah, well, first thing I look at in schedule every time, 1 o'clock games in September and October. That's the biggest home field advantage in sports. Any sport, any team, that heat in that stadium.
I agree.
It's the biggest. So I think they got one game, and so what that tells me, the NFL realizes it's an unhealthy situation for the opposition. That's the second game against New England, which feeds into your second question. Yeah, I don't like playing that many right off the bat.
Okay.
Mix in a couple other teams, because in a especially 17-game season, all of a sudden, how you start always matters when you're a fringe playoff hope, but it takes on added consequence when you're playing in your division too. So. I would just prefer, spreading them out a little through the first half of the season.
Okay. And little fun Fins fact here. This is the first time since 2010 the Dolphins have three AFC East games in the first 4 weeks. That year they opened at Buffalo, and like this year, they had primetime games in weeks 3 and 4. That year was against New England and the Jets, and I think they lost both of the primetime games. They won at Buffalo, lost the two primetime games. And we talked about in 1 o'clock September home games. They have the Chargers at home in October 12th, which is still going to be warm, but not quite the same as September.
Okay.
And for those who've never been to South Florida at that time of year or don't live here, it's bad. It's bad. It's no joke. And again, the fact that the Dolphins are in the shade at that time and the opposing team is baking on the sideline in the sun, that's what they've said, and I've said this before. Biggest advantage and home field advantage in all of sports. You know what? That's going to wrap it up. On that note, he is Dave Hyde from the South Florida Sun Sentinel, longtime cover of the Dolphins, right now immersed in the Florida Panthers as they go for a second consecutive Stanley Cup title. And wouldn't it be great if we were to say that about the Miami Dolphins at any time? Not going for the Stanley Cup title because they wouldn't, going for the Super Bowl is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I try to relate this to, I think about what would this city be, what would the fan base be like if the Dolphins went to two back-to-back Super Bowls and going for a third, and they won one of the Super Bowls. It would, what it would be like. It'd be like the 71, 72, 73 Dolphins. That's what it'd be like. And you haven't had that. I went around for that, and very few people were anymore. And so it would be fascinating to see, though, what South Florida would be like in that case.
That would be interesting, actually. I'd go for that. Sign me up. Sign me up. Please like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. He is Dave Hyde, South Florida Sun Sentinel. Check out his fine work at sunsentinel.com. Catch my written content on Miami Dolphins on SI.com, that of myself and my team. We will be back here on Wednesday, as always, barring news breakings. Thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your Monday and Tuesday.